The Suzuki DR650 has a reputation as a very solid, reliable motorcycle. Unfortunately, with that, it has a well-earned reputation for having terrible suspension. In this video series, I'm going to be sharing with you how I turned my Suzuki DR650 into an off-road monster on a relatively reasonable budget. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing with you how I went ahead and mounted inverted forks onto my Suzuki DR650. This is a very common modification that people do. The suspension off of a more modern motocross bike is leagues better than anything that Suzuki has ever offered on this model. So stay tuned. I'm going to show you how I did this from start to finish. Very first thing you're going to need to do is acquire a set of donor forks and related components such as the triple clamps, steering stem, wheel, and in some applications you may also need the brakes off of the donor. Although almost any fork can be swapped with some grit and determination, the most common swaps use either a YZ450 front end or a YZ450 front end. In this video, I will be outlining how I mounted a set of forks off of a 2003 Yamaha YZ450. I recommend the Yamaha forks of this vintage and era as they perform reasonably well, they can easily be found on the used market, and they can also be mounted easily without any machining, so it can easily be done by most people at home. I was able to purchase a full front end off of one of these bikes for $400, and I have seen similar deals since then. You may also want to consider picking up an entire parts bike, as sometimes they can be even cheaper than just buying a front end. So, the very first thing you're going to need to do to be able to get the forks mounted up on the bike, like I have here, is to get your triple clamp set up. So what I did is I took the factory triple clamps from the YZ450 off of the bike, obviously, and I also took apart my DR650 triple clamps. What I then did is I went over to my friends who had a hydraulic press. If you don't have access to one, I'm sure any local auto shop in your area may be willing to do it for a few bucks. So I went over there and I pressed out the Yamaha steering stem from the triple clamps, and I also pressed the DR650 steering stem out as well. So all I did is I pressed the DR steering stem, which has the same major diameter at the point where it presses into the triple clamp as the YZ stem, into the YZ triple clamps. Pressed that in. That allowed me to mount up these YZ450 triple Ts very easily and still utilize the stock DR650 bearings. I also didn't have to use a spacer here, which is common on some swaps. The benefit. So once you get the triple clamps mounted on the bike, your next step would be to slide in the fork tubes and then start thinking about which wheel you want to use. There's two trains of thought here. Some guys opt to use the stock DR650 wheel and then machine a spacer. I did not go for that because I wanted to have this be able to be done without any special tools in my shop here. So I used the stock YZ450 wheel because these are YZ forks. It obviously bolted up real straightforwards. If you do go with the YZ wheel, you're definitely going to want to get a bigger brake rotor. The stock DR brake rotor is 310 millimeters, and the stock YZ rotor is only 240. So I went with the 270 millimeter kit here. I believe it's from Galfer. It wasn't too expensive. It has offered reasonable braking. Kind of wish I would have gone with the Supermoto setup, but that's that. Works pretty good. This made mounting the wheel super easy. So with your brakes, whether you decide to go with the oversized brake rotor or not, you can use the stock DR650 caliper. It has the same bolting points as the YZ450, so bolts right on. I'm just using the stock brake caliper and rotor. In this case, I'm using the carrier bracket that came with the oversized brake rotor kit. You may need to use the YZ carrier bracket if you are staying with the stock sized rotor. Very few would. In terms of cable management, I just have this stainless rubberized clamp here, clamping it on, then a zip tie here to hold it on. I did originally have this routed on the inside of the fork leg, but I did have some problems with it flapping around, so I routed it on the outside. Haven't had any problems with that. Same thing with my cable guide posts. I'm just using stainless rubberized brackets attached to some longer pinch bolts with a spacer. Works beautiful, looks pretty clean. Super happy with that setup. So if you do decide to go with the YZ wheel, which I think most people will because it is the easier choice, you're going to lose that stock speedometer drive. So I ended up going with the Trail Tech Endurance 2. It just uses this little sensor right here and a magnet on the brake rotor to determine your speed, and I'll show you how I've mounted that up once we get to the headlight portion of this video. Now, one thing that's really great about using the YZ forks versus some of the other options is it's really easy to get a proper steering stop. All I did was I'm using the stock DR location and the stock location of the YZ steering stops. All I did was I drilled them and tapped them with a 6mm thread, and then I stuck these Allen bolts in here. And what that has allowed is that at full lock, the Allen bolts hit the stopper, forks don't hit the gas tank. Works beautifully. It was super simple. And if for some reason these weren't long enough or whatever, I can just stack some washers under them, or if they're too long, I can file them down. So really simple solution. Works good. No complaints about that. Overall, it was actually far easier to get the forks mounted on the bike than I ever would have imagined. A lot of people who do this swap probably opt to go with an aftermarket headlight. I actually quite like the look of the stock DR headlight, so I went through the trouble of mounting it on this bike. There's a few different ways to mount this. Some guys will order the headlight bracket mounts off of the YZ450 SM model, as it has inverted forks and it would bolt right on. I didn't want to go that route. They were pretty expensive on eBay, so what I ended up doing instead, keeping my stock mounts and then just cutting off the top and bottom loops and holding it on with hose clamps. I'll show you what that looks like right now. So you can see here I've got my stock headlight mounted using my cutoff brackets and some hose clamps I picked up from the hardware store. Some people may think the hose clamps are a little cheesy. Honestly, you can't really notice them. They kind of blend in with the forks, and they're super solid. So I've been running that setup for 40,000 kilometers in a few years now. Never had a problem with the hose clamps. Along with some other kind of lighting and controls, my turn signals here, I've just made a little bracket out of some 3/4 angle steel, bolts into the top hole, goes up a bit, and my turn signal bolts on. Those were super easy to make. You could get the metal for that at the hardware store, no problem at all. One thing some people aren't going to be super happy about is I no longer have a steering lock. So I am using the stock DR650 ignition mounted with one bolt and some spacers where the front number plate would mount on the YZ triple clamp. Works pretty good, super solid, never had a problem with that. I do know some guys opt for the DRZ ignition because it's quite a bit smaller, but I can't give any details on that. I've never tried it out. So when I first did this swap, I was using the stock DR650 fender. I just drilled out the holes a little larger and it bolted right up. I'm now using a newer YZ450 fender. It actually doesn't bolt up to the older Yamaha Triple T, so I had to drill some new holes anyways, but no problem on the 4 holes. To mount my headlight cowling, it bolts onto the headlight assembly we attach with the hose clamps there and there, and it does also have a lower mounting point right there. So all I've done to make this work is I got a piece of 3/4 by 3/4 angle steel, drilled 2 holes in one end that matched the fender, sandwiched it in, and then drilled a hole in the middle here, tapped it with a 6mm thread, so my screw goes in there, no problem. And I'll show you how it looks with the headlight cowling attached. As you can see, I've got the headlight mounted using the custom bracket on the bottom and the stock headlight mounts that are attached with the hose clamps, and it is not only super solid, it also looks somewhat factory, which is something important to me. Here's a look at how the cockpit looks on this setup. Pretty clean. Ignition switch is in a nice spot, not too dissimilar from stock. I still have the stock indicator lights attached to it. Solid, no problems. This is the Trailtech speedometer setup I was referencing earlier. I just have mine bolted to the headlight shroud. Nice easy spot to read. Works good. A little more modern than stock, so pretty happy with how that worked out. I believe they're only about $150 these days, so not terrible. You may notice that the set of triple clamps that I acquired did come with an aftermarket upper triple T. The only real benefit of this is that it uses fat bars. However, the stock upper triple T would work just fine. So all in all, not actually that difficult to do. And right now we're going to talk about tuning this setup a bit. If you install the forks without doing any fine tuning, you may find yourself disappointed with their performance. The inverted forks are significantly longer than the old ones and will need to be slid up in the triple T to compensate for this added length unless the rear of the bike is also raised. At the very least, you will want to complement this fork swap with a stiffer spring on the rear, or possibly take it a step further like I did, which is going to be discussed in a future video. The YZ forks come with a fairly soft 0.46 spring. Because of their more aggressive valving, they actually work alright with these soft springs. Stiffer springs can be rather difficult to find for these forks, and actually most motocross forks. So what I did to make them feel a bit stiffer is I made a preload spacer with some aluminum pipe. The length is going to vary depending on how aggressive you want the forks to be and how much you weigh. Any mod like this is going to affect the geometry of the motorcycle. So the key is to be patient and try a few different setups to get it to handle perfectly. It took me a bit to get mine set up, but once I had it how I liked it, there is no way I would ever want to go back to the stock 650 suspension. Alright, thanks for watching the video. Be sure to tune in next time where I talk about how to upgrade the rear shock. And if you have any questions about anything in this video or anything else that you've seen on this DR650, be sure to leave a comment and I'll get back to you. Thanks.